Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang, currently sheltering in place in San Francisco. Stocks surged this morning on hopes the pandemic was reaching its peak, then sunk back into the red by the close as New York State and the UK reported a jump in daily deaths. 731 new deaths reported in New York State, more than 850 reported in the last 24 hours in the UK. This as China reported no deaths for the very first time and is preparing to end the lockdown in Wuhan, the original epicenter of the coronavirus. We are standing by, of course, for that daily White House briefing of the virus task force in Washington. President Trump also today had some harsh words for the World Health Organization, blasting them for advising against travel restrictions. Of course, there's been much criticism of the president's response as well. This as UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson remains in stable condition in the ICU at a British hospital. I want to bring in James Camp now, Managing Director of Strategic Income at Eagle Asset Management. James, you've been watching the ups and downs along with the rest of us, and I'm curious if you think investors are simply going to be going up and down as these daily death tolls go up and down, and if that's really the only indicator now of how things are going.
Yeah, Emily, there's certainly a lack of clarity in what the end game of this might be, and you see it in the volatility measures. You know, one of the things that we watch very closely is cross-asset class volatility, and all of the asset classes spiked in mid-March. And when you see some better news, especially in the VIX or the equity market, you come off that elevated historic high of volatility to a more sort of normal elevated, and you can see some more real hard dollars coming into markets. But every time we get a fit and start from the headlines regarding the pandemic, that number then just moves around. To me, the risk markets are yet to be investable, and it's because we don't know, the ultimate path of where this thing goes.
So it certainly seems like there's nowhere to hide. I mean, are there any sectors that you are looking at for signs of hope?
Well, I think the thing that has to happen, and the analogs to the financial crisis may be relevant here, is that you have to heal the debt markets first. We had, actually, when I talk about volatility, that even existed in the Treasury market for about a week until the Fed stepped in. But now that the Fed, with their partners at Treasury, have created these facilities to buy corporate debt and municipal debt, you're seeing the new issue market wide open for investment-grade corporate. Those deals are oversubscribed. They're getting done. Their yield spreads are tightening. So the functionality of at least the debt side of the equation is up and running, at least in the investment-grade side. And that isn't sufficient to make the equity markets better, but it's absolutely necessary. So that's kind of job one in the capital markets the way we see it.
What's your view on big tech right now, given that, of course, supply chains are stretched, yet there's been this huge demand for more computers, phones, laptops, as folks are working from home, and yet you're dealing with financially stressed consumers and businesses?
Well, the returns to leverage we think peaked in mid-March, and that's a cycle end, both at the consumer side and probably on corporate balance sheet side. We're going to see savings rates in the U.S. go up probably in excess of 10%, and you're going to see less focus on leverage on corporate balance sheets. Now, obviously, the tech sector is the one shining star in terms of growth and potential for growth in a reconfigured economy, and sort of those secular changes probably are upon us and are going to be upon us for at least until I think there's a vaccination idea that brings people literally intimately close together in public space. So certainly the growth side of the equity equation looks more attractive than what you might call the value side. And if you're going to look towards risk-taking, well-run balance sheets, well-run companies that have reinvested in themselves through CapEx and R&D and not simply engineer their balance sheet, those are probably going to be the winners as we move through this period.
How much of an impact do you think this stimulus bill is actually going to have?
You know, Emily, I wouldn't call it stimulus. I'd call it life support. I don't say that to be smug. The patient is basically in a induced coma. The government has shut us down, and in the fact that the debt market's completely locked up, I think what these measures, they're requisite, they're necessary, they were rapid. Kudos to the Fed. They came in with some policy directives very, very quickly to basically turn the vacuum of asset class price collapse off. But in terms of what happens with Main Street, what happens with small business, I'm concerned about the clunkiness of it. I'm concerned about the frictions that will be getting checks to people and, in fact, getting support to employers and employees. And anecdotally, we all talk to small business leaders. We need to get that a lot more seamless, and we need to do that very, very quickly.
Absolutely. All right, James Camp, Eagle Asset Management. James, appreciate you calling in and sharing your thoughts with us. Speaking of life support, we're going to talk about whether tech companies can make enough equipment fast enough to help save lives. We'll be speaking with an expert from MIT next. Also, we will take you to that daily virus briefing at the White House. President Trump expected to be there. That expected to start momentarily. We'll bring you there when it begins. We'll be right back. This is Bloomberg. The White House has enlisted the help of supercomputers around the world to speed up research on the coronavirus for treatments, a vaccine, as well as location tracking, and to track just how the outbreak is unfolding around the world. Earlier, I spoke with Dan Stanzione, the executive director at the Texas Advanced Computing Center, which is home to the Frontera supercomputer, a computer that's been enlisted in these efforts. Take a listen to part of that conversation.
We have about 25 different projects now that we're supporting that I would put in sort of 3 different categories. And they're from researchers all over the country that have come through this mechanism that the government has put together to sort of expedite getting time on our supercomputers. The 3 categories are sort of things around people and social modeling. So we have some work on tracking social distancing and how people interact and the epidemiology of the virus. You see a lot of that in the media now with the forecasts of how many hospital beds will be required, how much intensive care, et cetera. At the sort of other extreme, we're working at the molecular and atomic level to try and understand the structure of the virus. We have working with Romeo Amaro, for instance, at UC San Diego, among a number of different research teams that are trying to model the actual structure of the spike and how it moves in the virus molecule itself, which it uses to get into the cell. And then you do various kinds of screening for drugs where you take chemical compounds and try and see if it'll fit on there and keep it from getting in. We have another researcher at UT looking at, can we use copper to coat it to slow the spread? So, and then the third thing is genomics, looking at the actual RNA strands in the virus, looking at the DNA of patients who are infected and trying to find common strands with other viruses where we have effective treatments we can translate things.
So what is it that a supercomputer is capable of that a regular computer can't do? Is it that you can do these things so much faster than a regular computer? Is it the teamwork between supercomputers around the world?
Yeah, fundamentally it's size and speed when it comes to the supercomputer itself. We sort of class it into things that are capability. We can just solve a bigger problem that wouldn't fit in a normal computer. That structural simulation, we're doing 200 million atoms at once. So you need a massive amount of memory and it just, your regular computer couldn't do it. Other things like the epidemiology models, we're just running tens of thousands of them at once. So it's a matter of just sort of the volume and the throughput. And most of these things are on one supercomputer. I would say the relationships piece isn't between the supercomputers, it's between the researchers in the life sciences who are doing some of this work and people in computation who know how to help them optimize their software and speed it up. For the collaborations we got going first are people that we've worked with for years and sort of know how they operate and they know how we operate. And having those sort of pre-existing relationships has really helped us get going quickly.
In your view, can these computers work fast enough to get us the things that we need now, essentially? Or is even, having the benefit of these supercomputers just not enough to get treatments, vaccines, get a handle on where this is spreading and how fast now, essentially?
So in the end, I think computing is not going to be our bottleneck. We can run these things pretty fast. There are many, many different chemical compounds we might want to try. And really what the computers do is help reduce the number of things we need to try in the lab. But ultimately for vaccines, for instance, we're sort of upstream of what the medical chemists do. All we can do is say, of the 10 to the 60th possible chemical compounds in the universe. Here's a very large set that we know won't work. Here's maybe a few dozen candidates to try, but it's still going to have to go through the clinical trials, and that's where a lot of time will still be taken.
Now, supercomputers are one thing, but also there's quantum computing, which, as I understand it, is even faster than supercomputing. And quantum computing is also being used to fight COVID-19. How does that compare in terms of what that can deliver and how quickly?
Yeah, so quantum computing, it's not something we're using in-house yet. It's something we simulate a fair amount, but it's really a different model of computing, and it doesn't really solve, at least the state of the machines today. They don't solve the same kinds of problems, but there's certain kinds of optimization problems where they are remarkably fast, orders of magnitude faster than a conventional computer, even a conventional large supercomputer, or they at least have the potential to be. So, there are pieces of this story where we can plug in quantum devices and get some acceleration. But for things, again, the structural modeling we're doing right now, the protein docking, that's probably not a quantum problem. We have high hopes that they might be useful in sort of using some AI methods to accelerate the drug screening.
Now, you're running simulations and modeling all day long. I'm curious, what are you finding most surprising, or is there one thing in particular that the results show that made you say, wouldn't have thought about it that way?
Mostly, I'm trying to keep millions of these simulations running every day for a whole bunch of people, and I haven't sort of dove deeply into the data for what a lot of people are doing. But I know we've gotten, some of the researchers we work with have come up with some pretty interesting structural insights into just particularly into how these spikes form and how tall they are and how they move, that I think will be awfully helpful in us coming up with better therapeutics down the line.
All right, we're getting some breaking news out of Washington that President Trump and his team is working on plans to reopen the economy depending on testing and how many people they can test. However, the plans would depend on testing more Americans than has been possible up to this point. The White House supposedly in the early stages of this plan to reopen the economy. We'll hope to hear something from the president when he speaks just about 10 minutes from now. He tweeted moments ago that the press conference would be starting at 5:30 Eastern Time. Meantime, I want to get to some of the expertise coming out of Johns Hopkins University Carey School of Business. Earlier today on Bloomberg Television, Associate Professor Alessandro Rabucci spoke with our own Tom Keene and Guy Johnson about the economic strain now being caused by the coronavirus, especially in emerging markets. Take a listen.
We are very close. Emerging markets have been hit very hard by the initial phase of the crisis. We've seen massive outflow of capital from most emerging markets repatriating in the United States. The COVID epidemic is just picking up in emerging markets. As we know, it lasts for about 4 months, and the peak is for 2 months. And emerging markets are much less capable of absorb the health dimension of the crisis. They will be put under extreme strain, and we expect to see unprecedented decline in economic activity and possibly widespread financial damages.
Professor, you are a world authority in real estate. It's something maybe diffuse, it's out there, it's not something we really can touch. How is the leverage within the global real estate system? Are they exposed as other asset classes were exposed in 1998?
At the global level, leverage in the real estate is not as diffuse and deep as in the United States. Typically, in emerging market, real estate purchases take place on a cash basis. So from that perspective, leverage in the real estate is not necessarily the most important problem. However, research shows that impact in individual communities affected by pandemic can be extremely long-lasting. So certain segments of mega cities in emerging markets may be particularly damaged by the crisis, by the health dimension of the crisis itself.
Alessandro, can I talk a little bit about what is happening here in Europe? Italy finds itself in a very difficult situation. Its economy already sort of burdened with a huge amount of debt. It's likely to take on significantly more. What is your perception of the economic trajectory of Italy and whether or not its debt is sustainable?
Italy is in a particularly difficult situation because it was already experiencing difficulty to recover from the global financial crisis. Effectively, Italy never recovered from the global financial crisis, and growth was permanently hit by that shock. These new catastrophe will be extremely damaging for the and help is desperately needed from the European community, ideally from the rest of the international community. There is a lot of talk about options for financial rescue through European mechanisms. I think it is the time to consider emergency help for international financial institutions and chiefly the International Monetary Fund, which helped other European economies during the financial crisis.
John Hopkins professor Alessandro Rebucci there. And of course, Mike Bloomberg, the founder of Bloomberg LP, is a supporter of the John Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Meantime, I want to talk right now about the worker agitation that we've been covering across the country and around the world, whether it's Amazon warehouse workers or delivery people, Instacart shoppers as well. Our Josh Idelson, who covers labor for Bloomberg News, has been valiantly covering the stories of these folks across the country. Josh joins us now on the phone. You know, we've been covering this day by day, Josh, and I sort of want to get a picture right now of what things look like now. These workers have been demanding better safety, better pay, better benefits, insurance. You know, where do things stand in terms of how companies are listening and whether they feel like they're being heard?
There are signs that this worker rebellion in sectors like warehousing and food and healthcare and logistics could snowball. We've seen more companies have more workers take part in walkouts or protests. Companies in general are not saying that they're doing things because their workers went on strike, but some of the companies that have been focuses of activism by workers, companies like Amazon and Instacart, have rolled out additional announcements about things that they're doing to keep their workers safe. Amazon has said there's more than 100 processes that they've changed to try to keep people safe. We've seen at Amazon the walkout spread from New York to Illinois and Michigan. We've seen other expressions of discontent and collective action. In the past 48 hours, we've seen nurses in Michigan stage a sit-in and work stoppage. We've seen construction workers on strike in Illinois, manufacturing workers on strike in Illinois. We've seen now the start of a strike at Target's shipped delivery company. And this question of, as the days go on, will this be getting much bigger? And if people are retaliated against or appear to be retaliated against, will that snuff some of this out?
Right. We, of course, covered the firing of Chris Smalls, that warehouse worker on Staten Island by Amazon, and he believes that was retaliation. Amazon says he was violating some of their safety protocols. You know, I've been looking at the feedback to your stories and our stories online about this worker unrest, and there are a lot of people out there saying, isn't there a line out the door? I wish, these companies would treat their workers better, but isn't there a line out the door? Don't a lot of people need jobs right now? What's the response to that?
That's why this is, in many ways, the best and worst time to be going on strike. One of the forms of leverage the companies have is you do have millions of newly unemployed people who are potential replacement workers. At the same time, many of these jobs are not easy to slot a new person into. These are not easy jobs. They are jobs that many people watching on Bloomberg working from home right now would not want to be going into work to do. And these are jobs that have been rechristened as essential work. And so you have a situation where there is a public spotlight on the workers who let these companies stay open and the companies that get to stay open. and on the need for the work that they're doing, whether it's producing food or goods.
Okay. Josh Idelson, really appreciate you continuing to cover these stories. Josh Idelson there for Bloomberg News. Coming up, we're going to take you into the online classroom. Just how are things going with homeschooling? And we'll get to Washington as that presser is scheduled to begin momentarily. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Trang. The Trump administration is working on plans to reopen the economy. This would depend on testing and the ability to test more Americans than has been possible up to this point. We're standing by for that press conference to start at the White House, and we'll hopefully hear some more details on this potential plan from President Trump. Meantime, I want to talk a little bit about how the online school situation is going. The numbers are staggering. More than 55 million students have been affected by coronavirus-related closures. 125,000 schools or so, public and private, closed across the country. Joining me now is the CEO of a video communication company called Prezi. We've talked a little bit about how Zoom has been an invaluable tool for a number of schools out there, and yet you've got New York City now banning Zoom in public schools. Talk to us a little bit about how this big experiment is actually going at home. What's working, what's not working?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Emily. It's been amazing to see that in our user base, so we have over 100 million users crossing business and education, that actually it's been the teachers who are leading the charge, and they're getting up to speed how to work from home in an effective way faster than anyone else. So as we see countries and schools shutting down, we see actually the teachers among the first to come online, and in a matter of 2 weeks, they are 40xing the usage of the video part of our presentation tool. So they are now providing the lessons in many ways for also the business way of doing video conferencing. And so some of the things that we're seeing is that, first of all, human connection is what drives the ability for students to learn, but in many ways for businesses to collaborate as well. And so these teachers are showing up with their faces, not just through emails, but through video. And the second thing that they're doing is they're realizing that you can't sit in front of the computer for 8 hours a day. So while we were at work or in school, we could be with our colleagues 8 hours a day, but that's not possible when you're working from home. So a lot of the times they're pre-recording lessons, assignments, and then they're calling groups together for discussions, and that is some of the most advanced ways of remote collaboration that we see in businesses, but the teachers get it immediately in just 2 weeks. And then the third part is our bread and butter, the visual communications part, which is essentially that even though you're on a video conference, you need to still have strong visuals to focus the conversation, to explain your ideas. And so little did we know when we, in November, we launched Prezi Video, that this would become so pertinent to so many people so quickly. But what you can do there essentially is to be a newscast person without having a studio set up. Anyone with an ordinary laptop and a cam can add those visuals into their video conferences or record them onto videos. And as you can imagine, this is unleashing a lot of creativity for people.
You know, my kids are doing this as well, and I wonder, should we as parents be worried about all the screen time, even if a lot of it is now more interactive, online worksheets, productive, not just sort of passive viewing, given that it is happening sort of hours on end?
Well, I think it is important to take breaks and obviously go away from the screen. But for all intents and purposes, sitting by a desk isn't necessarily that different. Having said that, of course, we should be mindful of how to have a good working day, even if we are now having to do that from home. So again, giving people flexibility to be able to consume the lessons at their own pace, but then making sure that you still have a community feel of getting together in shared meetings, I think is also important.
So, what do you think of these, new online habits? I wonder how much of this lasts beyond quarantine. Do you see students and teachers integrating more online lessons into their day, for better or for worse?
I definitely see that as a strong possibility. So people are picking up now skills on how to get their work done over video. And I think we're also recognizing that what we thought was a very effective way of going into the office and get stuff done isn't necessarily as productive as we always thought. So there will be some parts, I think, of the work that we do, whether we're teachers or just running companies. We will be doing some of that pre-recorded and of course, probably giving people a lot more flexibility to join remotely.
How concerned are you about the security and privacy issues here? I mean, I feel like we all know someone, or we've been in a session that has been quote unquote Zoom bombed, and obviously, some of these are very young people, young students, seeing some of these obscene things pop up into their Zoom windows. How concerned are you about that, or is that something that the technologists can easily get a handle on once they're prepared?
Yeah, so I think this is a real concern, but we also have to remember the bigger picture here, that Zoom has been adopted very quickly now for purposes that it was perhaps never intended to do. At the same time, we see the Zoom leadership reacting fast to these concerns. So I think they're going to solve it. And I think, when you choose to set up your online collaboration environment, it is, of course, important for teachers and leaders to choose secure options.
So how do you think, what does the reopening of school look like at the end of this? I mean, on one hand, there's concern about the resurgence of the virus. There's a concern that, perhaps now schools know how to do this. They could do it quickly for a shorter period of time. But I wonder what school coming back in session actually looks like. It's really hard to even imagine at this point.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. But one of the things that I believe is that the future isn't decided already. And depending on how well we do in terms of coming together and really understanding this virus and how to best behave, that'll really define the larger impact on just how smart solutions we find. And so for us, that's really our focus. When we help vaccine makers or teachers or public health advisors to communicate their messages, then we believe that we can come up with better solutions. And so I think it's just really important that we keep focusing on getting the science part of this and making smart decisions with a deep understanding of what's going on.
All right, Peter Arvai, CEO of Prezi, thank you so much. Really appreciate your insights, especially as a parent at this time. Coming up, the inside story of Instagram. Jealousy, promises, control, details that you've never heard before from my colleague Sarah Fryer, who is out with a new book right now. We'll be speaking with Sarah next. This is Bloomberg. Facebook bought Instagram in 2012 for over $700 million. And since then, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook have maintained a tight grip on what was then a burgeoning social networking service. Joining me now, my colleague Sarah Fryer, author of a new book called No Filter, which I have here in my home studio. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad you gave me my advance copy before the lockdown hit because I'm really enjoying it. You've got a new excerpt out in Bloomberg Business Week today detailing some of the early instances of perhaps disagreement between the Instagram founders and Mark Zuckerberg. And you talk about Zuckerberg's jealousy. Tell us a little bit how that came into play into the buying and the running of this service.
So Instagram was always a strategy for Zuckerberg to avoid the potential of competition with the company. And so once he brought them into the fold at Facebook, one of the first things he did was ensure that if Instagram was allowed to grow, that it wouldn't detract from Facebook's photo posting. So that was like the first sign when they came into the company that it wasn't going to be treated equally. And for the most part, Instagram was allowed to operate independently. Kevin Systrom on your show talked about how he considered Mark Zuckerberg more of a board member than a boss.